Hi, I'm Shlomi Ron. I'm the CEO of the Visual Storytelling Institute based here in Miami, Florida. And welcome to another episode of the Visual Storytelling Today podcast. Well, today I'm kind of really excited about the topic. One thing I haven't told you, I'm a great fan of cooking. I'm actually the chef in my house. And I also like to go to restaurants. In fact, the background behind me is actually one of my favorite hangouts in Miami. It's actually a great empanada place. So just figured it makes sense. And, even though we all were under lockdown during the past year, I was also one of those people that got swept away with the bread baking fad and started doing that. So all this got me to think about, the role of food and storytelling and how visuals can play a role in really bringing to life things that sometimes it's hard to articulate, like flavors and, some backstories of the chefs and so much more. So the topic for today is really, what is food storytelling? And to help us unpack this exciting topic, I'm super excited to have Shizue Roche Adachi. She's Director of Communications and Narrative Design at Real Food, Real Stories. Great company I just came across based in San Francisco. And they're really making a fantastic movement over there by connecting food and stories to change culture. So with that, welcome to the show, Shizue.
Thank you so much for having me. Excited to be here.
Excellent. All right, so we're going to start our journey by just kind of going back. If you can rewind your personal story, how you got started in food storytelling, what was that magic moment that made you decide to go in this direction?
Yeah, my journey with food and storytelling is pretty lifelong. In that I've always been a lover of food. I was always in the kitchen with my mom and my family, and story was so much at the heart of that relationship. My grandmother was a food writer, and so thinking about the stories behind ingredients, behind family recipes, behind my relationship was really core. But really that turned into a professional interest. I graduated from Yale University, and I concentrated in food and agriculture there, but really looked at rural sociology. And so that was a very academic way of thinking about your relationship to story and food, to think about the narratives of where our food came from and how those defined the people who were making them. And I really was in this direction from the production end of it. So I worked on a number of farms and ranches and raised sheep and cattle myself, actually, for 2 years. And part of really what nourished me in that experience is you're not getting paid a lot. It's not, you don't go into raising sheep or cattle for the money, I'll tell you that. But I was really drawn to those communities because of the stories that were wrapped up in folks' relationship to the food that they were growing. And actually back in college, while I was doing sort of my very academic orientation, I also picked up freelance radio producing. And I did a series of radio stories that sort of journaled my stories of my summer in food. It was on Heritage Radio Network.
Right.
And that was the first time that I was really exercising that muscle of bringing the stories that I heard, weeding across a bed in the gardens or in a farm, or riding horseback and interviewing, the lead cowboy, and brought that to the public, and felt like that was such an important experience of intimacy that people didn't have, because there's not that outlet, unless you're actually there on the fields, you're not going to be hearing those stories. And so, like I said, I went into the sort of food production side of things, and ended up stepping away from that, and most recently was working actually as a brand strategist for mission-driven companies in the food and beverage sector. That pays the bills better than farming. And it was interesting because it was a shift, but at the same time, it was all a continuum. It was still wrapped up in telling the best, most compelling stories about food and beverage and the people that make all of that possible, so that we really understand that we're part of this network of relationships, and that food is not just a consumptive practice, it is a creative practice. And you are in relationship with so many people when you sit down at the table.
No, definitely. Yeah, I think you touched on so many things. The first one that come to mind is obviously we actually share the same background. I also did my bachelor's in sociology and anthropology. And so I definitely can relate to that. Also did a thesis around, different restaurants and how they communicate their visual stories in terms of the space. The other part you mentioned also, which is so true, is the fact that stories are definitely, in my mind, really playing the role of bringing the why, because there's so many competition out there, especially in the food space. And if you are connected to the why story behind a specific product, the growers, the ingredients, there are better chances for the audience to really see themselves in that story and develop loyalty. So the role of stories is incredible.
Yeah, and I think there's an inclination, I think, to underestimate our audience's curiosity. Anyone who's worked in marketing knows that what's sort of like drilled into you is you have this tiny little window of time to make an impact with, a consumer or an audience. And I think that's true. We have limited opportunities, but it's how you use that opportunity. And sometimes presenting the beginning of an answer or a question is so much more compelling than just trying to compress all that you're trying to communicate into, a 10-second experience.
Right.
It's giving those, people that iceberg experience, that they see the 10% and they know there's 90% under the water, and they lean in. And yeah, exactly. And that's, and I think that is so much at the heart of it, is this idea of that, like, just because people are super saturated doesn't mean that they're not curious to connect more deeply.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's why we see in many packaged goods, my granola bag every morning, with my oatmeal, I always see that short story of, behind, the brand. And it's interesting. And you see these little stories, slapped on packages of variety of things that really want to create this emotional bond, that you're not just buying the granola, because everything is about, I think, you tell me, entrenching this deeper meaning, that I'm not just buying this granola and I'm forgetting about it. I'm actually, by buying this, maybe there's a charity behind it, maybe there's some higher purpose behind it. It's much more than just the actual product.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I work in the nonprofit space. And so for us, our aim is not just to change consumptive habits, but really to activate people as agents in larger cultural change.
Right.
But a lot of, the baseline for people is that first experience of thinking that, consumption is an active agency, that I can, by the choices I make, by the brands I buy or don't support, or the questions that I ask of my brands, I can be more informed and a more engaged food citizen, and
Absolutely.
I can contribute to this, to a deeper impact. And I think, it's a double-edged sword, right? Like, as soon as you have a market that is primed for storytelling, you're going to have the equivalent in the food space as you had in the eco space of greenwashing, so there's definitely a real risk there of lacking authenticity, or that like teeth. But I am glad to see that overall the trend is about, questioning sort of the industrialization of food that really dehumanized it and made people feel like they were just these discrete objects, and recognizing that even if your food feels unrecognizable to something grown in a field, there is some connection there.
Absolutely.
And that's part of the work.
Yeah, no, that's so true. So to kind of help our audience to kind of get deeper into our topic of food storytelling, let's kind of level set the definition of our chat. So a question I ask all my guests is how would you define visual storytelling?
Yeah, so I think, the storytelling bit of that is key, because I think a lot of people might think of visual storytelling as just visual representation.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a very different thing. You know, storytelling, like I said earlier, is about creating an experience that makes someone lean in. And so visual storytelling to me is a really poetic balance of providing enough information, but not too much,
Mm-hmm.
that sets up some sort of narrative experience for your audience.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the power of suggestion is is critical, I think, in visual storytelling. So, you know, from our perspective at Real Food, Real Stories, you know, we started with just live storytelling experiences, like, you know, in someone's living room. And that's very much about a one-on-one intimate experience. And as we've grown, and especially in terms of, you know, our social and digital platforms, thinking about how we translate this really intimate experience of belonging and the reciprocity of the storytelling space has meant that we've had to think about how to translate that intimacy, that deeper connection, and those, you know, longer narrative arcs into visual representations of our work and our storytellers.
Yeah, I really liked how you put the poetic connection between visual and storytelling, and how you allude to the power of suggestion, that it's really, you don't want to give out the full story, and you want to give some people room to complete the story in their mind, which makes, you know, the content much more interesting. So that brings me to the next question. You know, now that we explored the wider realm of visual storytelling, when we kind of zero in on food storytelling, what would be your definition?
Well, you know, I think storytelling is an ancient practice, right? It is embedded in the work of culture building and connection for Indigenous communities, and for it is the way that we have always sort of taught our lineages, who we are and where we come from. And that's, you know, a pretty, that has always frankly been tied up in food. You know, food is such a critical part of who we are individually, but more important as a collective. And so when you think about food storytelling, for me, it's not just about visual representation that you see in Instagram right now. Like, I don't consider, frankly, a snapshot of your meal on Instagram as, you know, real food storytelling. That is, you know, that is a great image that can be food storytelling if there's that context brought in. But storytelling is a practice, I think, to really revere, in that there is a sense of reciprocity in it. Like, it is not just something, exactly, it's not something that just washes over the audience. Like, when storytelling is really done and practiced well, it is met, you know, there's two people, you know, it takes two to tango in that. You're providing content or story, and the person who's experiencing it is offering you their presence and their engagement. And like you said, you're not giving it all away. They're leaning in and participating in it. So
it's the campfire experience in a way.
Exactly. And so food storytelling, to me, for that reason, it isn't just about representation. It can be, you know, the farm to table story became very popular. That was like a very trendy explosion of what food storytelling meant, which is a critical part of it. But also, food storytelling is about reviving foodways and telling the stories of, you know, your community and your neighborhood. It's about telling the story of family recipes. It's about telling the story of larger social inequities in our world, in terms of, you know, thinking about food sovereignty and food insecurity. Like, storytelling is so meaty in that way, that when you talk about food storytelling, it is cultural, it is social, it is political. It is, you know, it's all of it.
One example that comes to mind, I wonder if you could consider the food storytelling, even its atomic base shape, it's a recipe, because you have the ingredients, you have the instruction, you have the visual sometimes, and typically, you know, the writer starts the recipe with the backstory, how they received the recipe from their grandma, whatever.
Yeah, and I think that's an evolution that you've seen in, you know, food storytelling in the cookbook space, for sure. Like, if you go back and you look at a lot of the cookbooks that folks were cooking from, that were sort of like, let's take, for example, like Julia Child's Mastering the Art of French Cooking. A lot of the actual recipe, it's just this compendium, a ton of recipes, not a lot of necessarily like story around that. Of course,
Right.
that has
it's a new addition in the
yeah, well, and I think it's because people are valuing that more, and so they're asking for it. And it became a critical part. I mean, I've always loved that part of cookbooks, and actually, it's in the mainstream now. But if you think about those community cookbooks that a lot of church groups would have, it's a kind of long form American tradition. These community cookbooks where housewives would contribute a recipe, give a little blurb about where it came from, and share that straight from the heart. And I think it's been fun to see, especially in our work. We work to uplift and create platforms for food change makers to share their story, and those food change makers.
Maybe it's a good segue is to kind of introduce real stories and tell us what is the mission and the different programs you lead.
Sure. So I was just to end that thought. It was just that like food change makers having the experience of knowing that they're here not just to teach us how to eat and cook, but to share who they are and how they got to that. And the mission of Real Food, Real Stories is to grow more connected, resilient, and just food sheds or food communities. That term food shed comes from watershed, which is, basically the idea of geographically demarcating where the rain falls and feeds a particular geographic area. And similarly, food shed is a way of mapping your food community. When that term was first introduced in kind of the academic space, it was about specifically being like, okay, where do I get my tomatoes from? Where do I get my potatoes from? Put those dots on a map and I craft my food shed. Obviously now our food comes from nearby, it comes from very far away. And we also because we think of food storytelling as about not just where are my resources coming from and where are they going to, it's about who defines food culture. We define food shed as the mapping of all of our relationships to food. So it's a little bit more of a abstract, creative approach to that. But really, for Real Food, Real Stories, our programming started, the nonprofit started in 2015 with our founder, Peiru Ko, who suffered from a health issue, basically, which made her extremely sensitive to a number of foods. And in her process of healing herself, she struck up these really beautiful relationships with a lot of the farmers and food makers who had helped her on that journey. And the first Real Food, Real Stories storytelling gathering just happened in Peiru's living room as a way to thank all of these people, giving a space for them to share their stories and to feel her gratitude and the gratitude of the community that they nourished. And so we really started from that place of like, how incredible of an experience is it to really recognize that you are in community with your food community and to honor those contributions and to give a platform to people who are growing, producing, cooking food, especially people who typically aren't given those platforms. So BIPOC, queer people who have often been excluded from those narratives of food. So we have, since then, Real Food, Real Stories has expanded significantly. We now do facilitation trainings to support people looking to facilitate storytelling. We continue to have our gatherings. Now we have seasonal storytelling gatherings, an annual Story Slam fundraiser, and we're continuing to develop more and more programmings. We also have, of course, our social media and our podcast as well. And, we really started in a food and community advocacy space and have fleshed out to start to reach more into the media arts space, which I think is great to be on this call with you, because I think thinking about visual storytelling was not how we entered into this work, but is certainly integral to how we're continuing.
No, absolutely. I really like what you said about the food shed. It's almost like an ecosystem of different storytellers that are part of this long food chains that bring the food from the field all the way to table of consumers. So I'm kind of wondering, what is the process you're going through in creating those visual storytelling programs around those different characters along this, chain of, you know, cause and effect.
Yeah, and I think part of that is also we're using visual storytelling to shift from the narrative of the food chain to these food webs, and this idea of like, okay, how do we, both through visual representation and otherwise, audio representation, so on and so forth, make real to every person who eats food, not just where their food comes from, but how they experience that food. So partnering with visual artists and seeing them as part of our food shed has become a key part of that for us. So this idea that visual artists, culture makers, taste makers are part of our food ecosystem. They, not only do they set trends for us, but they kind of create sometimes the visual containers for the work that we do. And so a couple examples is, most recently we had our end of year fundraising campaign, which we actually donated this year, all of those efforts to our food community. So that funded our Resilience Fund, which provides micro grants to food workers and change makers impacted by the pandemic and California wildfires. And we partnered with a local artist, Yuri Choi, to help make that sense of community and reciprocity and action present for our audience. And we really wanted to work with her, not just to like tell her like, this is a commission, this is every bit of it, but to really bring part of her perspective to the table. And similarly with our Story Slam, we've worked with an artist, Dina Hashim, who in designing, one asset, which is the poster for this year's Story Slam, I really asked her to think about, the theme this year is recipes for resilience and what that meant to her. Yeah. And, she brought a lot of herself into illustrating that and thinking about, okay, how do we go beyond an illustration of like communicating, this is a night about food and story, and make the visual a story in and of itself.
Yeah, and I know you have a few examples of those visual arts from those artists. Maybe you can share them now just to kind of give more context.
Sure. So I'll start it off actually with the trailer video. I've muted it. I'm going to talk over it, but you'll see this is some of the work represented here is from Dina Hashim. We use this trailer as a way to communicate for our audience about Story Slam. For the first year ever, it's going to be a virtual gathering. And so we needed to up our game in bringing our audience. And this allowed us to incorporate clips like you're seeing here of previous Story Slam storytellers, integrate that with some of the visual work that Dina had produced.
It's like TED for food storytelling.
Yeah. It's, people like to think of us as sort of the moth for storytelling and events. And I think we're the moth, but with sort of like this larger agenda. It's sort of like for what aim, and that is, for a more connected food shed. And the visuals you're seeing here actually were from, a lot of them come from previous storytellers. We asked them to show representations of resilience in food from this challenging year, and created sort of this visual collage and audio from some of our alums. And this is a great way to have crowdsourced visual narrative work. And I think that's such a key part of it, is that it feels creative, collaborative, and engaging.
Anytime you do, user-generated content, people feel they have a skin in the game. They can see their art, they have some bragging rights, they have more reason to share the content. So it's all good stuff.
Exactly. And the other example I was going to share, let me just pull it up here, is this was just sort of our wrap-up post after our fall season, which was dedicated to celebrating Indigenous foodways. And so who you see here represented is Crystal Apepa, Burrell Jones of Tolone Lake Enterprises, and Karina Gold of Segurite Land Trust. Crystal, I forgot to mention, is a chef.
Mm-hmm.
And part of our season is we have, our live storytelling events with each of these individuals. But we also like to set up these experiences for our audience to create a little context. And a large part of how we do that is through our social media, through things like, graphic designed quotes that sort of spark questions, prompts that we sort of position. So to seed some of those questions that when folks come to the actual storytelling gathering, they're already having these like questions and ideas percolating for them, and they feel sort of alive and engaged.
That's a great approach.
So that they can really do their part.
They get to know the people, at least in the social media realm, and then it's much easier to interact at the event. No, absolutely.
Yeah.
I think in general, storyteller perspective is so critical to storytelling in general, especially, with the example you just showed, is the fact that people really want to see that people like them in featured stories, and it makes your content much more relatable. And I think what you're doing, with bringing different perspective from storytellers from different cultures, different part of the society, it's really, really tremendous. It's fantastic to see.
Thank you. Yeah, I think this year's celebrating Indigenous foodways, and this summer listening to Black voices in food really resonated with our audiences because one, it was, we'd planned these ahead of time, but ended up being obviously very responsive to the moment, particularly listening to Black leaders in food, that lining up with this summer's uprisings. And I think thinking about, okay, all this is happening around me. What is the perspective on this through the lens of food? What is the perspective? All these things are connected. And thinking about celebrating Indigenous foodways, a lot of people don't have they definitely don't have visual storytelling or storytelling representations accessible to them around Indigenous foodways often, but they don't even have visual representations. So, the work of colonization has really erased and our understanding of Indigenous foodways through the genocide of Indigenous peoples. And I think it is a powerful experience to realize that being present to engaging with that story is a radical act. It's not just about education. It is about activation. It is about helping to shift the balance of narrative power, because storytelling is power. Any one of us who have engaged that realize how powerful a good story or a bad story can be.
Absolutely. We see it every day. So stories are really great tools for making change. And I think, the fact that you are making these stories of tribal communities, their culinary cultures, more accessible to more people, for me, it was really new. I mean, because I never had a chance to read about it or know what are the staple food, for example. So this is a fantastic opportunity to get this word out to more people. And the way you kind of combine the visuals, you see the people, you hear their stories, and you, maybe in future events, you could actually taste their food. It's fantastic because, when you think about visual storytelling, typically when you communicate, as a communicator, that in order to kind of inspire the senses of people around food, you're really limited to, we say we eat with our eyes sometimes. So there's the eye, the sight, you're missing the smell, you're missing the taste, which are the core two senses for enjoying food, right? So how can you really bring the excitement around food where you have only, the spoken word and the visual?
Yeah, I think that's the question of how do you make your story juicy? How do you make people have that full sensory excitement? And I think, one thing we're doing this year for our Story Slam is we've invited a graphic recorder to join us, because not only was this about, okay, we're having this event that normally is in person, normally we're gathering around food in a beautiful space, we're seeing each other face to face. Like, not only is it about, okay, how do we capture this and then share it outward after the fact, but how do we have a sense of togetherness? How do we have a sense of ambiance? How do we have a sense of community? And so our graphic recorder is a way for us to not only, capture the stories and provide us with beautiful visuals to share that outwardly, but also, how do they help us to convey a sense of space when we're all, floating little Zoom faces.
Exactly.
So I think that's a key role. And that really is looking at, our graphic recorder, not as, someone we're just hiring on, but someone we're really actively collaborating with in that process.
Yeah, no, absolutely. This is fantastic. Listening to you, it's like you are really in dreamland doing a great food storytelling experiences. This is amazing. I'd love to participate in some of your events. One thing that I'm always curious also as part of the storytelling process is if you thought about it when you developing those food storytelling programs, the role of the memories and emotions.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think it's hard not to, particularly when you're talking about food storytelling, because it tends to be a pretty tender and emotional space for us. And a lot of things come up for people when they explore their relationship to food. A lot of that has resulted in like racial reckonings. I know for myself, I'm mixed race, and my reckoning with my relationship to food has a lot to do with, how Japanese am I versus how white am I?
Yeah.
And it's one of those places that I think feels a little bit more comforting and supportive in that work, because food never really, it's hard for food and food that you love to feel confrontational. It can spark the curiosity and it can engage in that stuff. But why, when we think about the power of food and story to transform culture, we're really honoring at that point that the reason why food and story have that incredible power is because it's really connected to us on a deep, heartfelt level. And that deep heartfelt is connected to memory. It's connected to family. It's connected to the deepest tap roots that we have.
Yeah.
And I think particularly that comes up, often during the holiday season. Folks focus a lot on what food means to their family or doesn't mean to their family.
Comfort
if they've
food, yeah, exactly.
And if they've lost connection to that, or if it's a big part of their holiday experience, often around Thanksgiving and Christmas and Hanukkah and Kwanzaa, all of those gatherings, that food is such a central pillar to that. And take for Thanksgiving, for example, not only is it talking about maybe positive memories of food associations and cooking with family or going over to family friends' houses for long-term traditions, it's so deeply connected to memory because it's actually tethered to a false story about the birth of this nation and the erasure of indigenous genocide from the story of Thanksgiving.
Right.
And so there's no deeper, more potent representation of how entwined the stories of food are to memory, is the idea that that turkey on our table has literally shifted our collective memory of who we are as a country. And that's a lot of power to put in a turkey.
Yeah, that's for sure. Which brings me, kind of personal question: what is your favorite childhood dish?
Yeah, you primed me that you were going to be asking me this question. I got to say it's a hard one, because it's like when you're a kid, you have, I probably, if you'd asked me when I was 6, I'd say something like, "Oh, stealing the cream cheese out of the fridge is a pretty great
or you
day
can choose your favorite comfort food today. That's fine too.
I did think though about, I would look forward to, so I mentioned that I'm part Japanese, and I would look forward to, usually around New Year's every year, my family would host a big roll your own sushi. And it was one of the few times when my mom would really commit to cooking a lot of Japanese dishes. and roll your own sushi is like a very home style sushi experience where we'd do like gourd strips, and we'd have, you know, shiso, and we'd have a lot of cooked ingredients. Most people think of sushi as being, you know, raw fish. And a lot of the like farm home style is based in uh, like cooked burdock and carrot and those things. And I used to love roll your own sushi days, and would look forward to them every year because it was just like, it was such a celebratory gathering. And for my family, my extended family, when we come together, we always come together around a good meal. And it's always an opportunity for us to connect to, on my mom's side of the family, to connect to our Japanese heritage. And I think that's a great example of that.
Oh, that's so wonderful to hear. I mean, it's a great thing to have, you know, this heritage, you know, both on the Japanese side and, you know, the American side, and kind of borrowing from each, you know, and kind of learning how to appreciate food in a whole different way. So that's fantastic. So we kind of nearing the end of our chat, and before I let you go, you know, one of the question I ask my guests is, what would you say would be your top 3 tips for marketers that want to kind of borrow some of the benefits of food storytelling to their work in their visual storytelling strategy?
I guess I would say the first one is, don't be afraid to be honest. I worked previous to Real Food, Real Stories for a coffee company called Wonder State Coffee, and guided them through changing their name from the name of an appropriate indigenous nation, the Kickapoo. And there's a lot of fear in reckoning with when you're wrong. But honest stories connect deeply, and you can carry people along in that process, even when it's a process of accountability. So I would say, don't be afraid to be honest. I would say always cite your sources. I think especially in visual storytelling spaces, and the fact that we live in such a fast content world, there's so much consumption, there's such an urgency, and that can sometimes risk appropriation happening in those spaces, and can also dampen excitement around collaboration. So cite your sources and don't be afraid to collaborate, because we all know that we get better together. And I think I alluded to this. The third piece is, don't be afraid of slow content. Slow burning content can have a huge impact. I know we're living in this fast content world, but you know, longer form engagement, or even if it's something short, but that sparks a sort of longer conversation internally. I'm thinking specifically of an artist that I love. She's a comic artist, Madeline Jubilee Sato. She is a visual artist who's a comic artist, but her comics are poems. And when you look at them, you have this experience of, okay, I know what I'm seeing, right? I'm seeing an orange and you know, plant and something else, but then she's overlaying on this very poetic, you know, reflection on maybe like what is the construct of the environment. And so my brain is processing it really fast, but I'm going to sit with that, and it's going to like simmer for me, and I'm going to marinate in it, to use a lot of food metaphors, for the rest of maybe not just that day, but for months. And I think that's something that's really beautiful, is to think about how to burn slow and to really like lay anchor in someone's, you know, being. I think that's a pretty, it's a lofty goal, but I think we can do it.
No, for sure. No, I really like the third example you gave, because I think, you know, the taste for more and not just giving out the whole farm or the whole story in this case is so critical. A lot of people tend to kind of, you know, give too much information, and sometimes less is more. And you want to really think about this, you know, even this podcast, you know, to your point, you know, it's a slow, I call it, you know, as part of a slow movement, slow cooking. You know, I actually bring guests only when I really find real interesting people with a really, you know, amazing contribution to, you know, the visual storytelling space I'm covering. So I do it only when I have this, you know, opportunities. So today we had the great, you know, chance to meet you today, and you share with us so many great things about food storytelling and, your process, the different characters, the different conflicts that you're trying to solve using visual storytelling by overlaying food and stories. I know we could have continued talking for hours about this because, this is just the tip of the iceberg, but we need to wrap up. But before we go, if people have more questions for you, how can they contact you?
Yeah, well, feel free you can always reach out to me directly. My email is Shizue, Shizue, at Real Food, Real Stories. And I also would love to invite your audience to, beyond connecting with me, connect with our organization if any of this work resonates with you. Our Story Slam is coming up on March 25th, Recipes for Resilience, which is featuring stories by 5 food all-stars and unsung heroes as they share their reflections on the incredible year that we've had and what resilience means to them.
And this is going to be a virtual event, right?
Exactly. It's a virtual event. You can find all the information on our website, realfoodrealstories.org, and 100% of the proceeds will benefit food workers and change makers impacted by the pandemic and California wildfires.
Thank you so much, Shizue. This has been fantastic. I learned so much from you today, and I hope my audience, listeners and viewers, also got the same kind of wow effect, from the amazing work you're doing in the food storytelling space. So until next time, stay true to your goals and keep safe and impactful. So thank you, everybody.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. Keep those stories juicy.
Yeah, exactly.